and welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm going to be telling you about a fantastic chance meeting that has given me so many answers to Peggy. So, those of you who have watched or listened to the podcast for a long time will know that usually for Peggy's registration day, 1st of September 1968, I do something a little bit special. I might go on a big trip with her, I might get her some cake that I share with people that have helped me keep the car going or enjoyed the car with over the year. I might buy her something a little bit special. In the past, that's been things like her badge bar, an exhaust that she's blown out, all of these sorts of things. And a few years ago on the podcast, I actually wrote a letter to her previous owners and said kind of all of the questions that if I ever had the chance to meet one of her previous owners, I thought I might want to get the answers to. Never thinking that would ever really happen. We're quite fortunate, I guess, that we get to have a brief chat with the person that's selling us a car, but sometimes they don't know a lot, or sometimes they want to hide a few bits and pieces because they want to get the sale of the car, and they don't want us to know some of the little secrets that the car's hiding. But I think most of us, given the chance, a fair few years into our ownership, would take the opportunity to have a chat with one of the previous owners of our beloved classic cars and find out some of the things that we've noticed along the way, why they're the way they are, when the changes might have happened. With Peggy, things like the modifications have always been an interest to me, and I was massively fortunate that this Sunday, on Peggy's registration day, I actually was able to do that. Those of you who listened to last week's podcast will know that I came across in one of the seats a little advert for Peggy for sale, and I estimated that it was the early 2000s because the listing said second owner, and based on kind of what I thought I knew about the car, I assumed that was the second owner from 1994 selling the car. But all of that has been changed since I had coffee with Steve and Pam, and Steve, who had owned Peggy from around 2004 until around 2014, 2015. So that advertisement had a mobile number on it, and I dropped that mobile number a message on Friday night, and I wasn't really expecting much of a response. I perhaps kind of assumed that the number wasn't in use anymore, again because I thought that the listing was a little bit older than it actually was. So wasn't really expecting a response, but I thought you don't find out anything if you don't try. Saturday morning, actually, when I was at Salon Privé, I got a phone call and it asked if I was the Morris Minor Owners Club, and it turns out that it's quite fortunate that my phone number is somewhat linked to the Morris Minor Owners Club, because Steve and Pam had been a little bit unsure about the message and had thought that it might be an interesting, really specific scam of some sort, or perhaps his old landlord, which we'll get onto, trying to get in touch with him. And searched the number, and it came up as kind of related to the Morris Minor Owners Club. So he rang me and said, "Is this the Morris Minor Owners Club?" And having kind of stepped down from the secretary role earlier in the year, I kind of said, oh no, not anymore, you need to contact the Derby offices during the week kind of thing. And he's like, oh well, I'm looking for somebody who sent a message last night about a car. And I was like, oh no, that is me. And we had a lovely chat. He was very surprised that somebody had got in contact with him from the advert, and I said, the listing was for the car being in Peterborough. Are you still near Peterborough? Because I am near Peterborough with the car, and I would love to meet up with you. And it turns out he was indeed near Peterborough and had actually seen the car going to work once or twice, which was totally unexpected. And he'd waved, and I'd probably waved back, but if you own a classic car, you get waved at quite a lot, so hadn't really clocked it. But it had obviously been quite a surprise to Steve to see the car up and around Peterborough. So my mind was like, oh my gosh, can't believe we found him. So I said, well, are you free to meet up for like a coffee or something, to have a chat, and you can see the car again and things like that, because it's just had a big restoration. And he was like, oh yes, that sounds good. And I went, are you free tomorrow? Because Sunday being Peggy's registration day seemed like a fantastic day to meet up with him. Turns out he was, so we agreed to meet up at a little farm shop that was between the two of us the following day. Now, it was only after I had agreed to do this and thought it sounded like a fantastic opportunity that I realised that there was a small chance that as a previous owner, he would absolutely hate some of the things that I've done with Peggy. Obviously, I've made her my own, and that's not standard, and some people might absolutely hate it. I had no idea what the car kind of looked like in his ownership, because there was only a very kind of mucky and dirty photo on the listing that I'd found in the car. So I had no idea kind of what his thoughts might be. So I did get a little bit nervous about that. But as we pulled into the car park, there was big waves, and immediately Steve and Pam came over to Jamie and I and started having a look around the car. And yes, there was questions about why there was so much red on the car, and I kind of explained why I'd done that and why I liked the kind of way that it looked and stuff, and he totally understood, which was fantastic. And he asked, oh, the steering wheel's different, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of part of the thing. And he was like, oh, so did you not get the wooden steering wheel? And immediately I was like, oh, I think this is going to be a really interesting chat, because it sounds like Peggy's had a few changes even in the short period between Steve selling the car and me buying the car. So after an initial look round and a checking out of the seats that had obviously been replaced and had meant that we'd been able to meet, we headed in and started having a chat. And we were there for 2 hours. Steve had brought along some photographs of Peggy when it was in his ownership. So he'd owned it for probably the second longest amount of time, and also had known it in the previous owner's ownership, which is something I had kind of hypothesized. So let me fill you in on what we now know about Peggy from that period. So my files begin in around 1994, which I had previously hypothesized meant that she had been bought in 1994, recommissioned, put back on the road, and then sold later on to what we now know to be Steve. What had actually happened is that Peggy was purchased in 1968 by a lady, probably in Northamptonshire, based on the registration plate. That's something that I'm hoping to find out by contacting the Northamptonshire Records Office. And very soon after she had been purchased, maybe within a couple of years, she was purchased by owner number 2, who ended up living in Peterborough. And he owned several properties in Peterborough, but also in North Wales. And he ended up being, in the early 90s, Steve's landlord. And Steve, has a mechanic at the time, did work on the car for his landlord. So most of the modifications and improvements were done by Steve, either when the car was his landlord's or when the car was his. And I get the feeling that he was probably doing a lot of the work thinking that one day the car would be his, and so a lot of improvements were made to kind of the usability, the handling, the speed. So all of the modifications, like the gearbox, the manifold, the carburetor, all of those were done either, what was the unleaded head, were all done by Steve, either when the previous owner had it or when Steve had it. And the previous owner had it until the early 2000s, by which time he had moved over to one of his properties in North Wales, which matched up with obviously all of the MOT certificates and things that I had. And he then sold it to Steve, and Steve had to go over to North Wales to go and pick up the car and bring it back. So my previous hypothesis that owner number 2 knew owner number 3 is correct, but Steve was owner number 2 on the logbook because for some reason the first owner, the woman, wasn't showing up on the logbook. So that's why the listing that I saw said 2 owners. And also why most of the kind of receipt collecting and things like that began in the early 90s, because Steve started kind of building this folder of all of the things that had been done to the car, collecting letters and stuff that had been written about the work that had been done. When Steve gets the car in the early 2000s, it has mini metro seats, but he had asked the owner to dig out the original seats because he wanted to change them back. And I'm so glad that the original owner had kept those original seats and had been able to pass them on to Steve so that he was able to make the changes that he wanted to the car when it was in his ownership. So he had the original seats. He was the one that had added the new strapping and the new padding on those seats and then fitted them in. But he had driven back from North Wales with the mini metro seats in, and the old seats kind of sat on the back seats upside down. He had also shown me some photos of what kind of in front of you would look like, and Peggy used to look quite different. She used to have a speedboat steering wheel, which was a big wooden and metal steering wheel that looked fantastic, and had been fitted with the boss out of an old Morris Minor steering wheel in order to make the horn, etc., all work as normal, and it looked fantastic actually. And I think if the car had come to me with that, I'd have never done a red steering wheel, because that steering wheel looked amazing. And also she had a load of gauges in the glove box, lots of clocks and gauges and things like that that would have been useful for you kind of keeping an eye on things. I'm quite happy to not fit gauges now, because it's things to worry about. I've got a voltmeter, and that kind of does enough for me. But I think if the car had come to me with gauges, I'd be absolutely thrilled. So I don't know where the gauges and the steering wheel had gone. Additionally, the wheels at one point were painted a gunmetal grey, and again, when the car came to me, and also some photos that I've seen from when she was up in Halifax, she'd gone back to kind of old English white wheels. So quite, again, it seems like somebody was trying to put the car back to standard, and had kind of taken away a lot of the original kind of modifications and stuff that Steve had put in, but equally left a lot of the driving modifications, the brake servo, the gearbox, all of those things were left, and still as is, obviously. So Steve had the car for around 11 years, and in that time she was his daily driver. He was covering about 2,000 to 3,000 miles a year, so not quite as excessive as me, and we've probably equalled out in terms of the amount of miles that we covered in our ownership. And it makes sense that perhaps in the period between she didn't cover all that many miles, because she seemed to go very quickly between several owners in what is about 5 years. As a daily driver, she had obviously taken on a bit of the strain of that on her paintwork, and at one point he had her resprayed and tidied up a bit, and there were some photos of that, and the work kind of matched what we had seen in terms of some of it going all the way down or quite far down in the paintwork, and other bits barely being touched, so the roof still being mostly original factory paint, all matching what we'd kind of found when we'd had our restoration done. The rear end incident and the door incident were not things that Steve was aware of, and this door, when they'd sprayed it back, was clearly in the photos that he showed me Trafalgar blue underneath. So the fact that this door has been replaced with a green one at some point is quite interesting. Steve did the metal door tops, he fitted those, and also the stainless steel exhaust that I've since had to replace twice, because they're just not made as well as they were when Steve bought his. What was really sweet is that Steve took Pam on their first date in Peggy, which was lovely, and clearly Peggy made a good impression, because it meant that Pam was still with Steve, which was lovely. And what was so nice is, I think if I talked to any of the owners between myself and Steve, because they had her for such a short period of time, perhaps didn't form any kind of bond with her, or weren't that interested in her in any way other than as a classic car, I don't think it would have been such a lovely chat and sharing of memories. But it was really clear that Peggy had meant an awful lot to Steve when he'd had her. He'd got some really lovely memories with her, and that he was thrilled to see the car again, and to see it being looked after. Whereas I think the people kind of in between didn't really have that affinity. Steve told me that Peggy had only let him down once, and that had been the fuel pump, but he'd got a spare fuel pump on board and been able to make the switch and make it to take Pam out in time, not too delayed. So again, Peggy's been very good to us as well, so it sounds like she's always been a very good car. He was absolutely thrilled to find out that she had a YouTube channel and that she had been on TV, and the names of both of those things were jotted down, so perhaps Steve is watching now. So after 11 years, Peggy needed quite a bit of welding, and welding was the one thing that Steve wasn't really able to do himself. He had done all of the mechanical work and stuff like that, and had a friend who usually did the welding, but he wasn't that interested in doing the work this time, which meant that unfortunately Peggy was sold and put up for sale. She was listed in the Classic Car newspaper that I found, and also in Minor Matters, and very kindly Steve gave me the copy of Minor Matters that she was listed in at the time, along with some others from his membership of the club, which were quite interesting to read and compare to the more recent editions, and see how far Minor Matters has come. She was listed, and by the time that she was actually published in Minor Matters, she'd already sold through other ways that she was up for sale, and she was sold to a solicitor in London who Steve was able to give me the name of, which matched up with what I knew from Sam in Halifax, as he'd bought the car off of somebody who had ended up finding that they needed to go into London too much and weren't getting the use out of the car, so had ended up selling it on to him. Overall though, it was so good to hear all of these things, get answers to some of the things that I'd wondered about, like the modifications and how the previous owners kind of mapped out, whether she was ever owned by a lady, because all of the names that I had were men's names, and presumably she was when she was in Northampton, but has since then been owned by men, and now I've owned her, so I'm definitely the longest woman owner of her. I learned that Steve never named her. I was kind of worried that I was going to find out that the car had previously got a name, and that was now going to have to perhaps become the car's middle name, but despite owning her for 11 years, I'd never ended up naming her, and was thrilled that she had a name now. And I highly doubt that any of the owners that owned her in the gap in between ended up naming her, because they'd had her for such a short time and didn't seem to have quite the connection that myself and Steve had with her. Pam was pretty keen to let me know that Steve was very sad to see Peggy go, and did later on end up buying a Rover P4. Interestingly, a car that I myself had considered as an in-between car while Peggy was away for restoration. Didn't actually end up needing one, but interesting that that was a car that we'd ended up considering. He'd ended up buying that car from down in London, driving down to pick it up, and that car ended up costing more than Peggy ever did, in various repairs and things like that, and was never quite as good as Peggy had been. So that is how we spent Peggy's registration day. It was so good to find out so much more about her life for me and to hear so much about kind of essentially 20 years of her driving around and existing in Peterborough before I have ended up doing much the same with her. And it's really funny how she keeps kind of coming back to that area. I'm sure that we'll stay in touch with Steve and Pam, and if there's ever any life events or whatever that they'd quite like a little Morris Minor at, I'm sure that will be easy enough for us to arrange. I hope you've enjoyed hearing all about what we learnt about Peggy, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and in the meantime, drive safely and happy motoring.